Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us on Table Talk. And it is my distinct pleasure to have me old buddy, Anita Roy, joining us from England. And I'm chatting with you from Bombay. Hi, Anita.
Hi, Peter. So nice to chat with you. I feel like I'm in a party because I can see have been in party were I in India, or had I been in India, or whatever the correct tense is of that. But they're being very quiet, which is not very unlike all of them in their little chat panel.
Come in and make noise a little bit later. But yeah, so we started talking about this because Anita promised, but she's not going to keep her promise unless perhaps those of you in the audience make some noise about it, to do some Sourdough stand-up and a song she wrote, but she said she's not going to be able to do that. But maybe if everyone asks very nicely. But yes. So Anita, anyway, I thought we just kick this part of the conversation off by just saying, tell me about your earliest kitchen memories, your earliest food memories.
Earliest food memory is actually not, well, okay, earlier, it's not really a memory of mine, but I am told that as a very tiny child, i.e. before, so I was born in Calcutta of Bengali father and English mum. And when I was just about able to crawl around and put solids in my mouth, I used to apparently steal the shondesh from Ma Kali's shrine in my grandparents' house and stuff my face, obviously, with delicious sweeties. And far from being told off, I was welcome.
All right, I'm not sure if this is Anita's connection or mine, but
Was that?
I seem to be getting some drop in my connection. Folks in the audience, are you hearing both of us consistently? Were you able to hear Anita through that?
Okay. Froze. Oh no, have I unfroze now?
All right. So perhaps, Anita, you could go back on that bit about your Calcutta.
Oh dear. Okay, so so many freezes. So when I was very small, when I was under 2 years old, because my family came back to England when I was 2. So I would have been a mewling, puking 1-year-old, let's say. And in my grandfather's house in Calcutta, there's a shrine for Kali in one of the rooms, puja. And I used to steal the sweets, the shondesh, from the offerings that were there for the god, as one does. I mean, if you're going to leave sweeties down where small children can get at them, they're going to get at them. So I was not told off, and this is a kind of family story that, you know, my grandmother, my takurma, would say, you know, oh, the sweets have gone because Kali has, you know, looked favorably upon our offerings. And she knew that I'd taken them, and everyone knew that I'd taken them. But it was her way of saying, Anita, who has come unto us is is the incarnation of the goddess. And I think that basically skewed my self-perception forever.
I'm just trying to picture you as Kali, but I think the British side of you was sort of like just living there and figuring out how to do this in a quiet kind of way, you know, of destruction and, you know, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Yeah, and a trident, a gentle trident at the patriarchy, but yes.
Yes, perhaps a little, you know, a sort of cake fork-sized trident, very politely poking patriarchy. in bottom. Yeah, so that's one of my earliest, well, it's like I say, it wasn't really my memory, it's a family myth memory of food. But I have to say that, you know, some of my sharpest food memories are of always those holidays in India, going to India as a kid. First, when I was 11 with my dad, and then subsequently when I was about 15, and then again and again. Because the taste and the smell and the sensuous complexity that you get from a mouthful of, you know, bhel puri or something is just like, it's just, it cannot be replicated outside of the country. It just can't be. I've tried, God knows. And I remember one particularly poignant food memory, which is a very distinct memory, when I was 11 and I went back to India with my dad. And it was the first time that I had spent any time away from my mum or my home. And I was terribly homesick for the first few days. And we landed in Calcutta in May. And I was 11 years old. So this was 1976. And my Shejo Kaki was beside herself, really trying to make sure that this little English girl didn't feel homesick, and that everyone was being so kind and so welcoming and so.
Anita seems to be frozen again.
Else was having luchi and aloo and all this kind of stuff, and very carefully.
You just froze again?
Oh no, what is happening with my internet connection, yar? Shall I try going nearer I might try going nearer the modem.
You're right.
It might work.
Yeah.
Okay, wait. I am going through, this is not my house, by the way. This is my friend Miranda's beautiful house. So I'm not totally sure of the internet connectivity here, but if I come over here, and this is Ziggy. Hello, Ziggy. Okay, maybe this is better. So, hello, dog. So I was saying about my aunt, my Shejokaki, who made this very special dish for me, so that I wouldn't feel homesick. And it was a boiled egg in its shell, hard boiled egg, and 2 slices of that, you know, that very sweet, very soft, weird processed little square bread you used to get. I can't remember what the brand name was, but it was pretty much the only bread you could get.
What, bread?
Yeah, something, and like every slice was square and about that big. Modern, thank you, Surbi. Modern bread. Bloody hell, it was horrible. And a dessert spoon. So I had 2 slices of this weird plastic stuff, a hard-boiled egg, and a huge spoon. Like you couldn't do anything with the spoon. It was like a serving spoon. Because they thought, oh, she won't be able to eat with her fingers. English, you know. And I just looked at this plate full of, you know, it was a white plate with a white egg and 2 white pieces of, and I just burst into tears. So I was like, I don't know how to deal with this at all. I have no idea what's expected of me. I don't want to offend these people. Have just landed from England. I'm here with my dad, who's freaking out because he's never looked after me on his own before. I am trying desperately not to be homesick. I'm trying desperately to do the right thing. They're all trying desperately to do the right thing and making me feel welcome and giving me food, because food is love, and food is, you know, it's what you do. It's your honored guest is coming and all of that stuff. And I just burst into tears, and I was just like, oh God, no. and everyone else was having like luchi. It was so unfair. so, so, so yeah, that was a really strong memory.
But yeah, I guess, from a broad point of view, all white people food is the same, right? Boiled egg and whatnot. They all in the same taste register.
Yes, it's all bland and it's all very pale. Anyway, after that first disastrous evening meal, and once my dad had taken them all to one side and said, actually, she's fine eating with her fingers, and we have, all kinds of Bengali food anyway at home because mum cooks that, and she's fine, like just give her nice things to eat like we are eating. Then it was fine, plain sailing, everyone relaxed, and I had a very good time.
So when did you learn to cook?
I think I always kind of just was around mum when she was cooking in the kitchen, so picked it up from her, really. My mum is a kind of an honorary Bengali. I mean, she's a white, ethnically English person from Essex who grew up in a very so her family background is very much like that plate. So it was hard boiled, it was tasteless, it was pretty bland, it was unemotional, and it was, yeah, like that's the kind of culinary equivalent of my mum's teenagehood, I guess, and young adulthood. And she ran as far from that as it is possible to get by falling in love with and following to India the dashing young Mihir Kumar Roy, who just thought the world of himself, hated being in England, and as soon as he got his degree here, buggered off back to Calcutta because that's where his mummy was and that's where the good food was. Saying to my mum, if you want to marry me, well, you better come and see if you like India, because that's where I'm living. So any woman who, who's worth her salt would have to live there because that's where I am. And I am the catch. This is me. So my mum said, okay, then yeah, fine. And so she finished her degree, and she's quite a lot younger than my dad, and bought she could only afford a one-way ticket at that point anyway. So she bought a one-way ticket to India, 1962, one. And they got married 3 days after she landed. My mum, not knowing any Bengali and never having really had a family, being a single child, and a very dysfunctional family. And yeah, they got married, and my father is the eldest son of 9. So when my mum arrived at the airport, little white 22-year-old, I mean, she was really young. She was faced with this sea of over-emotional Bengalis saying, you have come, or whatever the equivalent is in Bengali. No, I'm not even going to try and do Bengali. No, to me, I don't know, to me something. Anyway, so she then proceeded to be very much part of that family and learnt Bengali from Sanskrit from my grandfather, from my dadu, who used to cycle around. My mum and dad then lived in Udaipur. Oh, this is getting off food. Are we supposed to go back to food, Peter? No. Okay, so then my mum and dad lived in Udaipur, where, but it's all about food, actually. It is, in fact, all about food. So they lived in Udaipur, my mum hadn't actually told her parents that she was leaving England. Her own mother had died when she was 13, and she had the quintessential evil stepmother. Like, I think that my mum's stepmother was the character that Cinderella's stepmom was based loosely on. She was like that bad. So so then my mum married, and in Udaipur in 1962 wrote to her parents these little old aerogram letters saying, I am married, I live in Udaipur now. You will notice by the aerogram, I'm not in London anymore. And her parents, especially the evil stepmother, said, well, you know, it's not a proper marriage, obviously one of those heathen things, but since you are married, then we're going to have to accept that, I suppose, but don't have any children because they will be very confused and they won't know who they are. And so my mum wrote back and said, twins, actually. And this was my two brothers, Sanjoy and Ranju and Sanju. Sanj is here. He is the Sanjoy Roy in the participants, not any of the other 18,000 Sanjoy Roys that there are out there. This one is my big brother. So Ranju and Sanju were born in Udaipur. And when my mum was pregnant with them, and this is why I was saying it's all about food, ultimately it's all about food. When my mum was pregnant with them, she went off Indian food. She couldn't bear the taste of Indian spices at all. So she used to live on, and this is another family legend thing, but she used to live on these little tins of Britannia processed cheese that one of the only other white families in Udaipur in 1962 was an American family called the Biggses. And Marianne and Bud Biggs kind of took her under their wing a little bit, well, quite a lot actually. But one of the ways in which they got her through her pregnancy of two boys was by feeding her these little tins of processed cheese while she, I don't know, puked into a corner or something. So yeah, so that was the beginning. And then they went to Calcutta and had me, and then I ate the Kali's shondesh, and you know, I came into the world as, you know, the goddess, and there I am ever since, presiding over the Roy family in ways of which I know not what. But yeah, but food is quite central to all of this.
I mean, when you said tin, I was thinking, okay, wait, my mind immediately went, it's probably baked beans.
Baked beans are good. Baked beans can be good.
Yes, yeah. I tried making baked beans at home recently, and I came out with something that was not terrible because I wasn't able to find the correct beans for baked beans. You know, but I believe I have located them now, thanks to Amazon. So the next one, maybe I'll, you know, get closer, because I just had this thing of like, okay, I want to try and make baked beans. And this is a weird ambition, but baked beans the way it comes out of a tin. And I want that taste.
Yeah.
Because when I was a weird child, I liked baked beans. But yes.
Okay. Yeah, interesting.
So yes, so about the cooking bit and whatnot. So then when the family moved back to the UK, when was that?
Well, that was when I was 2 and my brothers were 4. So that was 1967. Great year for music. Great year for music. And if anyone hasn't seen Summer of Soul on Netflix, just switch this off, this nonsense, and go and watch it now, because it was fantastic.
This is live. That's not. You can catch that anytime. Carry on.
Anyway, yeah, so 1967 we came back, and oh, sorry, Sanj has corrected me. It's on Disney Plus, not Netflix. I am sorely sorry about that. You're quite right. I have a grandfather clock.
Yes, I did hear that too. I haven't heard one for a very long time.
I love this house. It's full of Cheshire cats and grandfather clocks. So yeah, we came back to England and we grew up initially in London. And my mum kind of continued to be in many ways a Bengali mother. She would make rotis and dal, and we'd have, good Indian food. Maybe, I don't know, like two or three times a week-ish. I don't know. Sanja's probably going to correct me on all of this. I don't know. I was too young to remember. Also, my memory is really, really bad. But I do remember as a kid growing up, every Thursday night, and this goes back to Summer of Soul also, so music, which you also want to talk about. So Top of the Pops. Do you know about Top of the Pops? Yeah. So Top of the Pops was the program to watch when you were young and you were in England and you were growing up and you wanted to be the happening music scene and all of that. ABBA, who've just now kind of come back again, they were Top of the Pops kind of fodder. So every Thursday evening at 7:00, I think, was Top of the Pops. And we used to religiously sit down with our dinner and watch Top of the Pops on a Thursday evening. And I always remember that Thursday evening was definitely the evening when we had Indian food generally, and meaning rotis, because we would spread newspaper on the floor of the flat, of the house we were in, and put the plates on the floor and eat on the floor, cross-legged, with our hands. And that was just a totally normal thing for us. And it was only a bit later really that I realized that not everyone did that. It was just I still think it's slightly odd that you don't naturally in England, or everyone everywhere really spends part of like really good family time is spreading newspaper on the floor, sitting on it and eating rotis with your fingers. It would just make the world a happier place, I think, while listening to really cheesy pop music and Pan's people doing weird dance sequences. It's a very happy memory for me, that.
Well, it can't have been that easy to have gotten all the ingredients at that time in England, right?
Well, we lived not too, we lived within striking distance of Southall, where you could get everything. So, yeah, and again, like a good Indian housewife, my mum would buy things in vast tins, huge quantities, and have, stocks of things. And then every 6 months or something, we'd go to Southall to stock up and then come back with great jars of ghee and, imli and stuff like that. Yeah.
And now that you were away from modern bread, so I'm sort of craftily trying to bring this around to what we're eventually supposed to be talking about, sourdough.
Oh, yeah.
If you remember. Yes.
Yeah. No, maybe that is, I hadn't really thought of it as part of a narrative, but I guess it could well be that my early traumatic experience with modern bread kind of, had its consequences. It had its own narrative drive, which was to prompt me from the deepest corners of my gut and subconscious into exploring the world of sourdough bread making a couple of years ago. So for those of you who don't know, I lived in India until 2015. So I was there for 20 years pretty continuously. living in Delhi. And then I moved to a small town in the southwest of England called Wellington. So the obvious memoir, From Delhi to Welly, will be out shortly. Not really. But I have the title. So if anyone's out there who is a publisher who'd like to commission me with vast advances, then leave your details in the chat.
Wellington left his imprint in lots of countries, right? There's one in the Nilgiris. There's in New Zealand.
There's one in Wales, I think, as well. It's a dangerous town to try and make your way to via sat nav, because you could be going anywhere, right? I could send you anywhere. So yeah, so it's a very different life. It's a suddenly very, very different life that I have here. And part of that is not having a job anymore. Like, I've always had an office job. I've always worked in publishing. I've always been a working person.
To India. When you came in to spend that long stint in India, 20 years, large part of your adult life, what brought you here? Why did you decide to come in for a kid who'd basically grown up in England? What brought you back?
I was working for Manchester University Press, publisher in the northwest here, and as an academic commissioning editor. And I, sorry, I'm being attacked by this dog. Urvashi Butalia is reminding us, small feminist publishing house in India. Yay! Oh, Urvashi, big advance I'm talking, yeah? At least like 10 or 15 rupees for you. So I got, it's a slightly long story, but when I was working at Manchester University Press, I was already in touch, I think, with Urvashi the Butalia, the legendary Urvashi Butalia, feminist publishing supremo of India, about some women's publishing, some rights sales and publishing-y stuff. And I also wanted to, there was something in me which wanted to experience India not as the Anita Roy within the family of Roy. I think that was a large part of it. It was, what would India feel like, be like? How would I deal with it, and how would it deal with me if I weren't, if I didn't have that protective cocoon of a million Roys around me? And I thought that was an interesting question. And so I asked my boss at that point if I would be allowed to take a short 3-month sabbatical to research the Indian publishing market and to write a couple of articles about it and to find out what was going on there, and also talk to La Butalia about these rights sales. And generally, that was the grown-up professional rationale for the thing. Personally, I was very bored, I think, of life at that point, and I wanted an adventure. So I went off and I had a very big adventure for those 3 months. And I came back having made some really good friends in Oxford University Press, people like Rukun Advani and Anita Roy and Thomas Abraham, and lots of fabulous and interesting and sparky people. And at the end of it, I got a letter, I think it was pre-email even, from Rukun saying, why don't you come and work here for a bit? We're reshuffling, we're reorganizing OUP. You could come and, be a commissioning editor here. So I said, yeah, that would be great. I said, how much will you pay me? So he said, we will pay you this much. And I said, that's not right. I'm not very good at decimals, but I think you might have made a mistake on the zeros. And he said, no, that's literally what people get paid in India. And I was like, oh, okay then. Cool, I'll do that. And I told my dad, and my father's reaction to that was very interesting to me. It was, why are you throwing away your career like this? Are you out of your mind? Idiot girl. You're taking a 90% pay cut. What are you doing? You know, it's just like insane. Because for him and for people of his generation, the professional step up in a career was to get out of India and come to the West and make your name here, and, you know, get a degree from a London university, and then you had that kind of, it's the whole, you know, colonial / post-colonial power structure thing of legitimacy. It's like, you can, where you get your legitimacy is in the West. For his generation, I think that was it was a very fundamental kind of thing somehow, because having a first-class degree from any university in India wasn't as powerful, wasn't as legitimate, I keep coming back to that word, but didn't kind of give you the heft of a sort of the Western kind of imprimatur of something. So I sat down with my dad and I sort of said, look, you know, I think that you know, things have changed very much, and that the centers of power are not like that anymore, and that if I go and get some experience in the growing economy in India, or, you know, in the, even just in the developing world, if you want to call it that, that is going to put me in a much better position when I come back and resume my career here, because people will look at that and say, haha, here is someone who has links or knowledge or experience or something of this emerging market, which is what we want a piece of, because we want to sell books, we want to make money. And the market over in the UK is kind of, or in the West, is at capacity. It's kind of, it's full, kind of shrinking, maybe even at that point. That's how I sort of rationalized it at that point anyway. So I thought I would go to India, I'd work for OUP, which is a great place to work for, to be honest. And for me, you know, having that thing of saying, oh, I worked for OUP in Delhi, and being half Indian and half English, and having that kind of dual lineage, whatever, it just seemed to make a lot of sense. So I thought I would go and try it out for a year or two and have a good time and eat lots of delicious food and meet lots of delicious people, and have lots of delicious conversations, which I proceeded to do very successfully, all of the above. And I thought I'd do that for a year or two, but then it came to the third year and I thought, yeah, you know, this is just like way too much fun. I think I'll stay on for a bit and then go back. And then I got offered a job with Dorling Kindersley and was with them for 5 completely insane, crazy years. A lot of fun, a lot of madness. And then I got pregnant and had my beautiful darling baby boy, Roshan, and didn't want to work full time anymore. And the lovely, wonderful people at Zuban, especially Urvashi, said, why don't you come and work with us, and you can work around your motherly duties. So I joined Zuban and I was with them for many years. And yeah, there we are. Oh God, you've got a lot of potted history there. Not much food. Let's talk about sourdough more.
Yes.
Should we? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess so. But yeah, no, I want to step on, you know, another thing, and you know, why you sort of barged into my head right early on from knowing you. I mean, there were a number of people who I had met through helping Sriram with the Kalagoda festival. Right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people who I sort of knew vaguely around social media and things like that. And one of the people, Sriram, said, we must chat with Urvashi and Anita because they're going to be a valuable resource. And they know a lot of people in publishing. They'll have suggestions, and they're also very generous with what they know. So we got in touch. And I remember that, and this is like 2005, on that 2005, 2010, somewhere in between. And we had very, very, very small budgets. And so we would, ask publishers, like, have you got an author who's coming to Bombay around that time? Because in that case, because so that we could save on tickets and everything. And but we had a few things for airfares. And I remember we offered you your airfare, and you said no, train ticket, please. And I was like, why? And you said footprint, environment footprint. And then I found out that Anita Roy cycles to office and basically lives her environmentalism. She's not just making, any visible statement kind of thing. This is her. So when did that, was that always a part of your life, your thing, your concern about your footprint on the planet?
Yes. Yeah. I guess it always has been. I think it's. I don't know. I mean, at this point in my life, at this point in the life of the planet, and also in my own life, there's a large and possibly increasingly large part of me which can't quite believe how anyone can be doing anything else apart from finding ways to be less less harmful to the other life forms who live on this planet alongside us, with us. And I, I've kind of become more of an environmental activist, really, because here I have the opportunity to do something physically about it. I've become a very, very active member of a group in my local town called Transition Town Wellington. And the transition movement was started up about 15 years ago by a guy called Rob Hopkins, who was looking for a way to for a way to work locally with in small groups and in local communities to affect very radical change in the way that society was organized, but by working within existing infrastructures, both physical and also organizational or societal. So instead of saying to everyone, you need to be entirely self-sufficient and to generate your own power and to process your own waste and be responsible for your own water and all of those kinds of things, which is, if you're a hardcore permaculture follower, that is what you need to do. And it's to follow the principles of permaculture thoroughly and successfully, you need a very, very specific set of circumstances in your own life, and you need a massively high level of commitment. And it could never really be anything other than for a very few people. Rob Hopkins came out of that environment saying, he's learned a lot from permaculture to do with regenerative agriculture, where you're not simply extracting from the soil, but you're giving back to the soil, and to do with restoring ecosystems, and to do with thinking of circular economies, and to do with lessening food miles, and just living more lightly on the planet. And he came out of that thinking, how do we come up with a way of translating this into something that ordinary everyday people can do. Like, what does that look like? And the transition in Transition Town is to do with transitioning away from a carbon-based economy to a zero carbon economy. So there are things like an energy descent plan for your town, which you can do. So looking at ways in which your town as a town, and it works at kind of town scale. And this is perhaps one of the drawbacks of the Transition Town model, is that it has a very optimum kind of size of community that it plays out really effectively amongst. So although, you know, in London there are organizations, you know, Transition Town Brixton or Crystal Palace, they're kind of like townships within larger conurbations, but it's getting local people and ordinary people to find ways of influencing the way in which their town is organized by using and collaborating with the organizations that are already running things. So your sewage company and the police and the schools and the highways department and your local council and your this and your that. And I think a lot of my time now is kind of has been caught up in that very, very happily, because a lot of environmentalism, I think I was really kind of filled with a sort of despair, I think, in India, at least in Delhi where I was living. I was filled with a kind of horror and despair that we had allowed ourselves to create an environment that was so hostile, that was so difficult, that was so hard to live in. The pollution was so bad, the traffic was so bad. Nobody seemed to be able to imagine their way out of more of the same, you know. And I think I was, I don't know, I found it very heartbreaking. I found it very, very hard to continue living there. I came back to England for all kinds of reasons, all kinds of other reasons, to do with my mum and dad getting older, to do with my kids, wanting to give him a different kind of experience in life, different educational, you know, ways of being, all kinds of things, not least, you know, wanting some more oxygen in the air that I was breathing, wanting to be back in the countryside.
You also paid a price with your hearing as well.
Well, my hearing my hearing, I came back to England. I was telling Peter just before we came on that my hearing had been, but I hadn't realized how badly damaged my ears had been by living in Delhi for 20 years. I came back to England and everyone sort of talked like they talk like that, and I was kind of constantly going, what, sorry, huh? Again, come again, your pardon. And so my mum and dad, who are now in their 80s and 90s, and I were all doing the same thing. Family full of mildly deaf people. And I finally realized that I had to do something about this, because it was clearly not only that English people tended to talk very softly and to mumble. There was clearly something on my part that wasn't working quite right. And what I realized was that, and this is some things that I hadn't realized, when your hearing is impaired, you do a lot of lip reading and your brain does a lot of infilling. So what you think someone has just said is usually what your brain is telling you is the most likely thing they would have said, right? What this means is that conversations are rarely surprising, and new information is rarely gleaned. Because when someone says, I don't know, I can't do, I had a frog for dinner, your brain says they must have said, I had a fried egg for dinner, right? But actually they're telling you that they have found an edible frog, which they had, prepare. I realized that essentially, if I was going to go through life allowing myself to be hearing impaired, life was going to be less surprising, and I would learn less, and the world would be confirming things to me rather than challenging me. Because when something challenges you and you think you might have misheard it, you tend to think it can't have been that. Mm-hmm. So I went to an audiologist in the hospital, and I had a series of hearing tests, and did all the readouts and blah 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 blah. And he looked at the readouts and he said, this pattern of hearing loss is not to do with age. And I just assumed that it was just old age. Like, we're all getting there. So he said, do you have any idea why you are having difficulty hearing? And I said, I think it's because I lived in an incredibly noisy city for many, many years. And I realized, most of my conversations, of which I used to have a lot in India with these bright and wonderful people who are always interesting to talk to, were held at this pitch because you had the fan on and the air conditioning going and the traffic was going past, and also everyone else was speaking at this pitch because you couldn't hear anything. So then you had to speak even louder. Do you know what I mean? So then I came back to England, and everyone was like, oh, rather loud person. I said, I can't hear anything. So I said, I think it's because I've lived in India for 20 years. And he said, yes, I think that makes sense of this particular pattern of hearing loss, because essentially it's affecting this middle range of frequencies, which is where your consonants are. I said, oh, really? I didn't know that was a thing. He said, yes, it's not so much the volume of things that's missing, it's the distinctness. Mm-hmm. And I said, yeah, that kind of makes sense, because I mean, things are a bit quiet, but then, we're in rural Somerset, so things are a bit bloody quiet. But it's actually the distinctness that you get from consonants, which it was just all a bit blurry at the edges. So then I had a hearing aid fitted. And I hated it. It was like reality was being recorded for a radio show and then transmitted simultaneously into your ear. So, and it felt like it felt like my life was being lived simultaneously in it, and also simultaneously in a hospital corridor recording of it. Okay. It was the most bizarre thing. And my mum kept saying, no, just stick with it. Your brain will sort it out. It'll be fine. You just got to give it a chance. It does feel really weird to begin with, but it'll settle down, blah, blah. Simultaneously, I was doing an MA in travel and nature writing at Bath Spa University, because I wanted to do more with my writing and to find ways of writing about the natural world, because it's so fucking beautiful and amazing and lovely, and I just wanted to write about it. So I was doing this MA, and quite a lot of it was standing in woods with groups of other students going, aha, goldfinch, oh, chiff chaff, oh, wren, I could hear the wren because wrens are really bloody loud, but everything else, I would just sort of go, yes, haha, chiff chaff, thinking, I don't know, I just, maybe. I can't hear. So, so, um, so yeah, it was kind of frustrating, and more than that, at times it did reduce me to tears, because quite literally crying, because I felt like I suddenly had something of an inkling of how socially isolating it must be to be deaf, and not just isolating from other people and their speech, which is what I had kind of assumed. It's actually a much profounder sense of not having access to the world in all its fullness. One of your senses being attenuated, sort of somehow, it was almost like, I imagine, being an amputee or something, that you suddenly realize that, without your hand, bottle tops are an insurmountable object. So yeah, there was some quite kind of existential lows when I thought about my hearing, and how it would never come back, and just the sort of battery that one's delicate, the tiniest bones in your body and that most delicate membrane of your inner ear, the kind of battering that takes on a daily basis when you live in urban India, and how almost kind of, I don't know, almost cruel that is. Like how hard do you have to, how much protection do you need to put up in order to stop that damage? And then one day I was in a wood. There's a place called Kinkham, which I wrote a little book about, which is in Dorset, not very far from where I live. And I used to go down there once a month, every month, and write a piece about the landscape there and the changing seasons of the year and so on. And I was standing in a wood on my own, having driven there one, I think it was like April, May day, standing at the edge of the woodland. It was incredibly beautiful, totally peaceful place, sunlight filtering through the trees. I'm recently back from Delhi, so even the smallest leaf is a source of such supreme kind of ridiculous bliss, joy. I mean, I just feel like I'm on serious fantastic drugs all the time, because everything is so flipping pretty and beautiful. And so I'm standing there listening to see if I can hear the bird song, which I know must be in there because it's springtime and this is an English wood. And I'm listening and I hear something. And then I hear something like this on the inside of it literally feels like someone's tapping. And so you do that thing where you yawn a bit to kind of clear your ear. So I yawned a bit and it did that again, like quite distinct 3 knocks. And it did feel like someone had just turned the dial up maybe. And I thought, okay, this happens, you yawn, your ears clear, then it settles down and you go back to. So I went walking back to my car, feeling quite happy and springy and full of the joys of, bucolic English countryside. Went back to the car park, turned the car on. The radio came on at the same volume as it had been on when I left the car. And I started the car, started driving. I'm going to have to turn that down a bit. It's like really loud. So I turned the radio down, which is the first time that I had turned anything down since I had come back from India. I was constantly turning things up. So I turned it down a little bit and I could still hear it. And I thought, I'm not going to jump around and say, oh, miracle, miracle, because I'm sure it's not. So I just let that continue for a while. But actually, since that day, which was now 3 years ago, maybe 4, I haven't used my hearing aid. And my hearing, I know, is not great, but it is not so bad that I need to have a hearing aid. And for that, I am hugely grateful. I'm massively, tearfully grateful. And it felt like, and I don't know if this is the case, but it's certainly what it felt like, is that the physiological barriers that I had to erect in order to protect this tender, vibrant thing, which is not my dog, but my ears, had needed about 2 to 3 years in order to relax enough to come down enough to allow the world back in, is how it felt to me.
It's awesome. I mean, we hadn't got around to the last part when we talked about this before. So yes, I'm hearing this for the first time too. But yeah, I know what you mean about the assault. I mean, we think of pollution so often as things that are more tangible to us in terms of just the quality of the air that we breathe, and then we become aware that the food that we eat, what we put into our bodies, is also uh, affected by our environment. And my dad, for instance, spent years of his life in a very noisy work environment. And there was a bit of hearing disability in the family. My dad's father, my grandfather, had his hearing fade away in his late 70s and 80s. And my father's but started going in his 40s and 50s, thanks to a work environment. And you don't realize how much effect that has. I mean, I have become, as a result of being someone who likes being by himself a lot, I'm very, very conscious of noise, of sound. And the city can hurt just by the assault. I need to close down. I need to go somewhere quiet. I need to not have that happen. And so, I mean, I can sleep in bright daylight, with lights on, all of that kind of thing, but sounds wake me up. But,
interesting.
It's a good thing I can sleep during daylight because, that's my body clock. But yes, so
yeah, I mean, it was I think one of the things that was most discombobulating about the whole lockdown last year was we were, as a nation and across many nations, collectively experiencing something which we had literally never experienced before in our lives, which is that quality of silence and that quietness. And it was quite scary, I would say, and almost otherworldly to be outside and fully hearing, at least as good a hearing as we could have, and be conscious that there was no underlying traffic noise and there was no overlying airplane noise. And it felt really post-apocalyptic, full on scary. I mean, I was simultaneously enchanted and absolutely freaked out. I fully admit. I don't know how it was for you.
It's a little bit weird because I have tinnitus, not severe, but it's like I can always hear the sound, the sound that a tube light makes when it's near the end of its life, or an old vacuum tube TV when you turn it off and there's still a sound. I hear that all the time.
That's echo of the Big Bang in your head, Peter.
And most of the time, because of a certain amount of background noise in the city,
Yeah.
it gets tuned out. Your brain can tune it out. It's not acute tinnitus, which can be debilitating, thankfully.
Yeah.
But in lockdown, because of the in quietness, I became, again, I was more frequently conscious of that high-pitched whine in my ear all the time.
Yeah.
So, which otherwise I would only experience if I went to, say, a snow-covered place, because
Yeah.
snow has that insulating effect on sound. And then
Yeah.
you can't, and then the tinnitus would be really loud if I was in the mountains in the snow. You know,
Yeah.
beaches and
Yeah.
all that are fine because there's always the sound of wind and water and everything. Forests
Yeah.
are fine because there's always wind, whistling through the leaves and things like that. But
Yeah.
that was the side effect of that for me. But Anita, one of the things when we first started talking about this was like, how do you fit into this entire conversation? And I said that I actually saw this intersection for you of the different facets of your life. It's, the kind you chose to work. A large part of your publishing career was on publishing for young people, young Zuban, writing for children, that kind of thing, writing for young adults. Your reason for moving back was partly also to give your son more of, the kind of opportunities that he could get there. Your choices in terms of your transport and thing, all of these have all been towards this, a better planet, trying to give back something that we've taken away and ensure that there's something that of quality that goes on to the generation that's following us and the generations to come. But specifically on that, and I guess since we're about an hour into this, we should, at this point, I think, talk about how sourdough fits in. How does making your own bread, what does it teach you? And why particularly sourdough, really?
Great question. Great question.
Only the name of this conversation, but yes.
Sourdough bread is, I think, it's just such a fantastic combination of completely mind-numbingly simple and completely mind-numbingly complex. It's just great. Like, at its absolute simplest, it is flour and water. That's it. Like there is, it's like the building blocks of food. It's almost like not food itself. It's just like the most basic thing ever. Flour, water, bus, that's it. The thing that I love about sourdough is that each time you make a loaf of sourdough bread, it's different. It's just always slightly different, because unlike making bread with baker's yeast or little, dried packets of yeast you can get. So in that dried packet of yeast that people normally would make bread with, there is one ingredient, which is baker's yeast. It's called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, something like that. Anyway, it's one yeast. In sourdough starter, which is essentially flour and water left for a day, half of it chucked away, more flour and water added, more flour and water added, half of it chucked away, more flour and water added. You do that for 5 days, and at the end of it, you've got this kind of bubbly, slightly vinegary gloop called sourdough starter, or if you're feeling pompous, the mother. So, so you have this pot full of mother, and you add that to your flour and add more water to it and start pummeling away, and eventually that becomes your sourdough loaf. Now, in the sourdough starter, in the mother, there are not hundreds, but certainly dozens of different types of microbes. So there's various kinds of yeasts, including Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but that's only one out of a whole load. And there are also bacteria. And so it's basically like a microbial soup, a bit like, you know, in the last few years, people have got very conscious about their gut biome, you know, determining how they feel mentally and how their body is and how they emotionally are. And it's all down to the health of your microbial inner being, you know, the zoo that lives in your tummy. So I think of my sourdough starter as a kind of little zoo that lives in a Kilner jar on my kitchen windowsill, which is a complicated combination of yeasts and bacterias, which are, in fact, I now know, unique to not just the UK, not just Wellington, but in fact unique to me. So there's been loads of research about the different kinds of sourdough starters in different parts of the world, and, you know, in different latitudes and altitudes and all sorts of stuff. And they're all chemically different. They're all biologically different, actually. And one of the things they realized was that, for example, and I'm sorry if this is getting a little too intimate for people, but, you know, bear with me. Sourdough starter made by women, or sourdough bread made by women, is different from sourdough bread made by men. Did you know that?
And why?
Why? Great question. It's because women have vaginal yeasts. So in our skin, there are yeasts specific to having a vagina that men just don't have. So female made sourdough bread, because you're using your hands, the stuff of your hands, the microbial, the biome, which is you, gets in there and forms part of whatever it is that you're making. So I was kind of amazed by that. I was like, and it's not to do with kind of washing your hands or kneading with your bottom or any of that. It's just like
yourself into your work.
Yeah. Yeah. So apparently that makes female sourdough bread slightly creamier and in taste than one baked by man. Don't know. But also, you know, sourdough bread that's made by someone in Birmingham would be different from mine, because the bacteria and the yeasts that are in the air that go into making the starter are specific to your location. So I just loved the fact that, I mean, so I know that you were talking about like living lightly on the planet and the environmental side of my my life and all of that. There's something also that kind of, something of the same cross section happens when I talk about sourdough bread, because it is another it's another way of kind of reconnect. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit philosophical here, but it's another way of kind of reconnecting your inner and your outer self. It's a way of it's a very concrete, like specifically tangible way in which place affects thing. And I really like that. And I think that place and thing connection is something that in modern life we have worked extremely hard and very effectively to break that connection. So in the same way as going to Connaught Place and going and having a wimpy, and the French fries being the same that you can get in Oslo.
Yeah.
Chain stores which are predicated on uniformity and the severing of that link of thing from its place, like it could be anywhere, and that's its charm, that's its raison d'etre, in fact, it's the complete opposite of what I think makes life meaningful, worth doing. It's even, I don't know, something like what's true. It's sort of, it has a kind of say something to do with authenticity, or I don't know. I fear I fear that the modern technology, apart from anything, and capitalist modes of production have kind of severed, possibly, well, actually fatally, and possibly irrevocably, the link between who we are, what we consume, and how that affects our environment that we are part of.
Thinking about this being connected with okay, I'm hesitating to use this word because Kartika Nair is here and it's French pronunciation, terroir.
Terroir.
Yeah, sorry, do I have to clear my throat at the bit?
Yes.
Yeah. So with that thing is now become something that people who are perhaps more aware of what they're eating, if you want to look at it that way, or food snobs, if you want to look at it another way. But the importance of terroir and all of that kind of thing is something that I think that I find it very encouraging that younger people are increasingly conscious of what's happening with the environment. This may be by my bubble, it may be just what I'm hearing, and it may not be universal. But overall, conversations that I keep hearing out, I hear a lot more from young people today than I did when I was their age. Your son, for instance, is vegan, right? And, I see young people. Kirtana was on one of the early episodes of Table Talk. Her daughter's vegan, and she's vegetarian. And you have that. And for her, it was living on a farm and being involved there and saying that, oh, meat is that animal that I know, and making that connection. But I think another part of this entire thing of bread making, of understanding your planet, your place in it, a lot of it comes, I think, and what you said also about the French fries in a McDonald's in, Connaught Place, tasting exactly what you would get in Oslo or Chicago or whatever. And it's a fact, they grow a certain kind of potato because that's the potato that does well with fries because of the liquid content being exactly the right way, etc., etc. But where was I going with that? I think I forgot. Yeah, I was trying to build too many thoughts back into that one thing. But yeah, I've lost it completely on that one.
Do you know,
Yeah, no, carry on.
Will it come back to you? I think it also ties in with, so the children's story that I wrote, Grave Pyre School for the Recently Deceased, was very much about exactly this thing, which is, it's about death and it's about mortality, and it's about it's basically a book that tries to talk about our endings and our limits as humans, as physical animals, as mammals, in a way which doesn't soft soap the fact that we are temporary beings and we will cease to be. And we're part of that cycle of, that natural cycle of birth and death and regeneration and birth and death. And that's what life is. We are we are temporarily the forms that life takes. We're not anything really very much more than that, which is in itself a miraculous and wonderful and amazing thing. And to find a way of telling a story which didn't soft soap that, which didn't say actually this character did die, but actually not really. It doesn't soft soap it, but because it's for children, it needs a very positive and happy ending. Now, how do you do that? So that was the kind of challenge that the story set for me, and I hope that I hope that it succeeds in both of those ambitions, which is to look at life and death in a clear-sighted way, and also in an ultimately very uplifting way, because I think it's really important for children to have stories that are positive. I think I mean, there was a meeting that I went to that was kind of when Extinction Rebellion and the Greta Thunberg thing was just kind of really kicking off, and I went to a meeting in one of the local village halls around here, and I actually got very choked up, because one of the topics that came up, one of the questions that came up, was how do we talk to our children about these issues? Like, it's a very, very, very bleak thing to as much as fully and unflinchingly look at the extinction of a single species is a very, very hard thing to do, and most of us can't do it. It's too awful. And to try and find a way to talk to young people and to children about the extremely bleak and difficult future, immediate future, nowness, in fact, of what's happening to our environment in terms of biodiversity loss is it's really hard. It's really hard. And it's really important that children are informed about this and can talk to their peers and to their elders about their fears of that, and about their questions and all of that. I think it's really important to not shroud it in silence, but I think it's almost certainly equally as important to to find ways of comforting them and protecting them from things at the right age. It's something to do with age appropriateness, which I think I learned a lot. I think I learned a lot about that during my time commissioning books for young people at Young Zuban. And I don't think it's something that you can teach very easily. And I think that I got it wrong quite often. But I certainly came out of my time, commissioning books and writing for young people and reading a lot of stuff and talking to children, and just kind of understanding where they are kind of emotionally at different points in their life. I certainly learned a lot from being in the thick of that for so many years. I'm really not in the thick of that anymore, and I think I would be much more hesitant about I don't know, sitting on a jury or even writing a book review of a children's book now, maybe. than I might have been. But maybe that was, I don't know, maybe that's also the arrogance of youth, the arrogance of middle age, as opposed to the less arrogant late middle age. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know. That's a lot of I don't know.
Part that in terms, and I also got from it, which is that kids will pick up more from what we do than what we say, right? And the doing is important. I think Roshan is an example of that, in the fact that he has seen his mom live her life a certain kind of way, and those values are within him. And no amount of teaching, of telling, would have taken the place of the life that you have lived in showing him that kind of thing. And this entire thing, I think the connection that I was trying to make at that point about the McDonald's fries and things like that is that we are separated from the means of production. The more processed food that we get, and I don't mean just technically highly processed, but stuff that, apples from New Zealand or whatever it is, out of season fruit and all of those things are sort of separating us from the earth. The ingredients that we use and where and how we use them and how they're processed. I'm not going on an anti-technology rant here. Technology is very good when, for instance, people mourn about traditional ways of doing food have vanished. But those traditional ways of doing food relied on the labor of women for long hours to be able to produce that food in a certain kind of way, to grind those masalas when you could do it in a mixer now in like 1/10 the time, rather than, with a grinding stone or whatever it is. But the counter to that is that I remember asking about this in the Simple Recipes group at one point in time. Do you know the mix of masalas that you use, the spice mix that you use? At one point, your mother, people around our age, people in their 40s and 50s, would know a certain amount of this because our mothers may have taught. I didn't, because I was a privileged son who didn't have to learn to cook. But for a lot of women, you'd pick that up. But the daughters and sons of my friends now actually don't know a lot of this stuff. So I wonder at some points whether that's a good or a bad thing to have things. I mean, on one hand, technology, packaged goods, getting ingredients from other places does reduce the labor, and the labor primarily of women, because women wherever in the world, the primary burden of preparing food comes to women. Or is it a bad thing to be so separated from how your food reaches you on your table? Where do you fall on
that? There's this fantastic guerrilla gardener from LA whose name completely escapes me, which is really bad because he's like one of my all-time heroes. Big black guy who decided that it was an absolute crime that people in his neighborhood had to get into a car and drive, 8 miles to buy a tomato, to buy any kind of fresh vegetable or fruit. There were endless numbers of fast food joints and blah, blah, blah. Nobody could go, there just weren't any fresh fruit stores available in that very urban, outskirts of LA, I think, place. But there were lots of, old used car lots and spare bits of pavement and derelict parks and whatever. He said, okay, we're going to just grow shit here. So he started this kind of revolutionary kind of guerrilla gardening thing where the local kids in the neighborhood would see someone digging some earth up and they'd say, what are you doing? And he'd say, well, we're making a garden here. We're going to grow vegetables. Do you want to help? And then they would help. And it became a bit of a phenomenon in TED Talks and all the rest of it. And one of the things that he said in the TED Talk, which really struck me, was, if you are having problems getting your kid to eat a tomato, just wait just get that kid to grow a tomato plant and they are gonna just love the tomato, you know. And I think there is a very distinctly different feeling that you have about an edible thing if you've had anything to do with its growing process or its harvesting process, or, you know, knowing that it comes from this kind of plant, or knowing that it's ripe at this particular time, or, you know, that, I don't know, it is a very, it's a very wonderful and surprising thing. And I think certainly during lockdown, and we've heard a lot about the two really huge problems in modern society. One is anxiety and depression, and one is obesity. Now, I remember when I was growing up in the 70s, I remember my mum saying something rather disparaging about Americans being all terribly fat, like very sort of, you know, oh, it's just terribly bad. They're all so fat, very bad. And I was looking around, and English people generally weren't. I mean, you didn't see that many oversized, large-sized people. I was looking at the government figures on obesity and overweightness, and they are really shocking. And it's now over half of the population is clinically, technically overweight, and a very large proportion of those are classified as obese. And that comes from what we're eating and the lifestyles that we live, obviously, but also, you know, the kind of food that we eat is creating these really unhappy bodies. Because I know, you know, when I feel bloated and heavy, and I think most people feel like, oh, if I was, you know, a bit slimmer, lighter, whatever, I would have more energy, I'd feel better about myself, blah, blah. And I certainly feel like that quite often. And it's hard carrying that much extra weight around. It literally brings you down. It's very kind of obvious to see the two of those things focused on the food that we eat and how we eat it and our relationship to it. So yes, maybe this is a point at which to bring other people into the conversation.
Yeah, and Nilanjana Nilanjana, are you okay to turn on camera or just microphone if you prefer? So I do remember one of the things here with this conversation, I do remember Nilanjana, after meeting you in the UK, said to be, you know, it's sad to not have Anita in Delhi, but she has really, really found herself, you know, in England. So she had a question which she, would you like to ask that on audio, or should I just read out your question, Nilanjana?
Okay. I think you should read it out, Pete, while I dispose of this dog, which is getting increasingly annoying. Ziggy, I'm sorry, mate, but I'm going to put you in the kitchen.
Cool. Anyone who does want to join in while Anita is getting Ziggy otherwise occupied, just let me know if you'd like to join in. It's okay. For instance, I can ask you to turn on your microphone and you can ask on audio. And if you're comfortable with it, I can also ask you to join the panel on video. That's entirely up to you, either which way. So Nilanjana, I just sent you a request to unmute, so you can just ask your question on audio.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hello, Anita. So I have a long and complicated question, but let me try and break it down. It seems that you went through a lot of different changes in Somerset. You know, it was a progression of things. you were baking your own bread, but you were also tending your own garden, growing your own tomatoes, herbs, etc. Learning to, I don't know how to pronounce it. to, yeah, thank you. Working, and then you learned how to build walls. You learned how to work with the land itself, and that forms a large part of your daily life. And I noticed that it seems to have nourished your own writing. And so basically, does the way you live now, has that fed a more creative life in general?
Thanks for that excellent question, Nilanjana. I would expect nothing less than an excellent question from an excellent critic like you. Ha! Has it fed into a more creative life in general? Yes, I would say, yeah, definitely. But part of that has definitely got to do with not having a job. I do a lot of freelance work, and I do have to earn some money, but I am in the ridiculously privileged position of having my own house, because I am a ridiculously privileged person, because I have parents who have helped to support me financially in getting my own place. So the pressure, the time pressure, the sheer time pressure that most people have, that they need to earn their rent or their mortgages or their whatever, I'm sort of weirdly and unexpectedly and extremely blessedly free of, which means that a lot of the environmental work that I do, I can do because I am not under those kind of pressures, and I can do because I'm living in a place like this, which is a very, very privileged, it's a very privileged corner of the world. And so on the whole, I think, yes, I do feel like I'm able to sort of integrate many of those questions in my life that I find compelling, which are to do with the physical, the mortal self, the imagination, the natural world, the wild, and the somehow trying to step away from the supremacist in the human supremacy premise, which I think is a myth of the most pernicious and far-reaching kind, human exceptionalism and so on, and so that kind of side of myself, which is perhaps, as I mean, but I don't know. Yes, the short answer is yes. More creativity, more joy. Yeah, a lot of joy. I think I was always quite a joyful person, and I spent quite a lot of time thinking that, I hope that my being as ridiculously happy as I am in England, it isn't a reflection of how miserable I was in India. I mean, anyone who knew me, in India didn't look at me and think, well, there's a miserable old cow. She probably ought to go back to England and be happy. That wasn't the case at all. And I wouldn't have not been in India for 20 years for anything. It was fantastic. But yes, go over. long rambly sort of answer, but
Moving on from that, which Nilanjana was left in chat as well, which is how we relate to the world around us. And is that changing, do you think? I mean, some of it is, I think, living where you live is important. And if you live in a city, your relationship to your planet is a very different one from someone who, say, lives in, it doesn't even have to be in complete isolation out in the forest or anything, but to live in a more rural kind of place where you actually seeing food come to you one, and you know where the food comes from, all of that. It does make a difference. And in this time, I think I hope at least that in India, having seen that the plight of farmers, of people from small town and rural India who were walking back because they had no other way to go there with lockdown on. And the fact that even sitting here in a city like I am, or many of the other people are here, we were still sitting in our own homes, not moving anywhere, able to get food come to us. And I think, and I hope that there's a greater appreciation for what it takes to bring food from where it's made to our urban dining tables. And do you think that relationship is changing? And do you think that this pandemic has had any effect on that whatsoever? Was it something that was happening anyway, do you think?
I do think that it was it's certainly the first time since the Second World War, or just after, that any of us here in England anyway had a kind of reminder or a notion of what rationing might be. And of course, being English, we all rushed to the supermarket and hoarded all the toilet paper. I don't know why. So bizarre, so bizarre. But I think for the first time, people had a sense that things were not infinite, and I think that this is the myth that has really kind of propelled us to the edge of this particular abyss. Is the myth that things are infinite, that they're really, that economic growth and that products are always going to be there because they're kind of created out of thin air, and they're used and then they go back into thin air. That there's no sense that there's a kind of like when you're growing something in your garden, you have to water it. If you feed it more good organic stuff, it's going to give bigger, better, tastier fruit. It's really simple. And then the bigger, better, tastier fruit you eat, and the leaves and the peel and the whatever you put in the compost, and it rots down and it makes more compost, and that means the nutrients going back into the soil to make another plant with big, tasty, nice, delicious fruit on it. The myth that we have grown up with is that we can eat it, take it in, and that's the end of it. There is no giving back. There isn't, like, that humans are somehow have abstracted themselves from this cycle. Even down to, what I think that the thing that I'm a little uncomfortable about in your very kind characterization of me is that somehow I'm this amazing environmentalist, and I'm really not. If I were, I would be composting. I would have a manure toilet, and I would be composting my own shit, because that is, to not do that, to not literally deal with your own shit, is what has brought us to this sorry, disastrous, catastrophic, climate changey, point where we are severed from our own consequences. The consequences of our existence it seems as though we think that we are the full stop of it, and we are not. I mean, when you throw something away, there is no away, as that sort of famous phrase, there is no away. When you do something, it does have consequences. When what has happened to us is that we no longer see ourselves as nutrition for anything else. When we were hunter-gatherers, or back in the day, 10,000 years ago, you went out hunting with your tribe, and your relationship to your prey was respectful, in the sense of, you please, antelope, elephant, whatever, let's call it antelope, consent to your role as nutrition for us in this particular moment, as we ourselves consent to being preyed on and feeding something else when our time is due. Whether that be a bear, a tiger, a shark, a worm, a microbe, fungi, our bodies, you can't have life without death, right? I mean, it's a stupid thing to think. And when people say, what's the opposite of death? Is life. It's not its opposite. There is no opposite to life. The opposite of death, it may be birth, but it's not life. Life is what flows through our myriad changing forms. It's nothing more or less and miraculous than that. So when we stop seeing ourselves as nutrition for something else, we do think of ourselves as a full stop, and we're not. And that's what's tipped the whole thing out of terrible balance. And that's one of the ideas that I wanted to play with in Grave Pyres, is this idea that the world is out of balance because we've lost a sense of our own mortality and the precious mystery and wonderfulness of that.
There is, I think, just growing stuff, what you're doing, have that child grow a tomato. And I think I sort of bang on about this so often, but I've been trying to grow a curry patta plant. I'm not even very fond of curry patta, okay? But I've been trying to grow a curry patta plant, and I have saved it from fungus 4 or 5 times by, just wiping each branch, each little twig with tissue to take the fungus off. And this year, during the monsoon, I thought finally it seemed to be flourishing. And then bloody caterpillar came and basically totaled every leaf from there, and then hung itself on there and made its chrysalis and whatnot. And I was like, okay, fine, fuck it, you're going to be a butterfly. I'm glad you eat my curry patta, but
Bastard.
But yes, bastard. That was not nice of you. But the thing of being connected, I think, comes a lot there. If you just try to grow something, very little, just do a little thing of compost and put your compost into your flower pots, let it decay and grow something out of it. I have stuff that I have grown in pure compost. I'm fortunate that I live in a suburban kind of atmosphere. I have place to grow things, and it's not that easy to grow things in a city. But even if you put a flower pot in your kitchen and grow, mint or curry patta or whatever it is, that little bit more respect that you get for it. But Kartika Nair had a question that was specifically about Grave Pyres, which you had touched on. So Kartika, would you like to ask that question Nair this time?
Thank you, Peter. Anita, it was actually, hey, It was actually about, picking up on what Neela said about the relationship between food and creativity. And I wanted to know that during the last, among the many phases of Grave Pyres, the Wellington years, did you have food as a specific either succor or reward? Were there food rituals associated to the writing?
So part of the last set of revisions and so on that I did on Grave Pyres, I wrote in another writer's shed. A writer called Jay Griffiths, who is a very like one of my absolute idol genius writers. She's completely amazing. And she wrote a book called Wild, A Journey Through the Senses, through the Elements, which I completely adore. And I think it's an incendiary piece of writing. And I've got to know her. And she has a house in the middle of Wales with a quite sort of tumble down little shed in the garden, and she offered her shed to me as a place to write. And so I went off there for about a week on my own, writing in Jay Griffith's shed, which was a huge privilege and a really beautiful little place. And Jay is unlike me. So see, I like wine. I do like a glass of wine. I'm not a great beer drinker, but Jay is a great beer drinker. And it's cheap, nasty lager beer that she likes. So there was this fridge full of cheap, nasty, really great lager beer. And at the end of a day, if I'd done a good day's writing, but actually secretly, even if I hadn't, I would have a bottle of Corona beer from the bottle in the shed as my kind of end of writing day ritual. So there you are. Not very nutritious, not very organic, not very environmentally friendly, but really hit the spot.
And Kartika, the other Kartika VK has a question, more parenting. Kartika, you want to just ask it on audio?
Hi, Anita. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's so good to see you. It's so good to see that smile. And Peter, thank you for setting this up. Anita, I've been really curious about how you manage that shift from here to there in terms of Roshan. I know that schooling must have been really different. The world must have been very different for him as well, right there. So what was that like? I mean, he's now, I suppose, flown and is grown up and happy doing whatever he's doing. But what was it like for you?
That is also a really good question. My son has become something of an activist in his own right over the last few years. He's become very involved in Black Lives Matter and Kill the Bill protests. Not so much environmental stuff, although his passion is more in terms of anti-racism and and social justice. So his dad is very, very proud of him. Of course, Naga being both climate activist, but also so involved in human rights and all of that. But Roshan's really found a lot of connections with young, culturally and ethnically diverse young people in Somerset. So we live in the part of the world that we live in is very, very white. There's not much ethnic diversity here. And I think for Roshan, it was quite, he is one of the most socially adept people, full stop, that I know. I mean, I take a little bit of credit for this, but not entirely. I just think that he is an amazingly socially adept person and has a very strong sense of self. But over the last few years, particularly since the Black Lives Matter protests, happened, and with so much more public discourse and discussion about and around the different kinds of way that racism expresses itself, I have to kind of check myself when I say to people, oh, you know, Roshan fitted in really easily and he's so good and everyone adores him and, you know, how can you not, and blah, blah. Because actually I'm someone whose skin tone is a little bit lighter and I speak with an English accent, which he didn't have when he came over first. And he looks more Indian than I do. And his experience, or the way that people look at him as a young brown man, as he is now, I can't, in all honesty, second guess that's like, even for someone that I know as well as my son. So it's a slightly tricky or incomplete answer, Kartika, to be honest, because I look at him and how he has changed given his different educational environment and the kind of peers that he is with and the kind of expectations that people have of him here. And they are very, very different. I mean, one of the things that happened when he first came to Somerset was that his English teacher, I went to a PTA meeting and I was chatting with his English teacher, and she said, you know, I think that Roshan really needs to work on his sentence structures, and he's not writing complete paragraphs, and he needs to be a little more expansive in his answers and blah, blah. And I said to her, well, the thing is that, you know, we've just moved from India and he's not, I think he struggles a little with the English idioms because his idioms are very, very Indian English. I mean, that's, you know, he has just grown up entirely as a Delhi boy. He's now having to adjust his hearing in the same way that kind of I was, but differently, to the Somerset accent and to how kids speak here, and also to how English teachers speak. And it'll take a while. I just, you know, said to her, you know, just give him a little while because it needs a bit of adjustment. And she said, oh, I didn't realize that you had moved from India. I will try and enunciate my questions to Roshan a little more clearly. And I was like, no, please don't do that. Ah, no. Wrong. So I think it did require, and it does require, a retuning of your ear and your following of speech patterns on the one hand, which he did very adeptly and very quickly. But it also requires I don't know, that in itself also requires you to hide a little of who you are. And I think that Roshan is now, with the impetus of the Black Lives Matter movement and with the other non-white friends that he has made through those kind of mostly Zoom meetings, and, you know, there's this thing called the Eclectic Collective that they've formed, these young people, and they're talking about things like, you know, what does it mean to be mixed race, and who gets to say what is authentic, and where, you know, when someone asks you, where are you from, what does that mean, how loaded is that, where are you really from, all of that kind of stuff. Through all of that, I think he's reconnecting to some of the bits of himself that necessarily he had to kind of hide in those early years, which I'm really delighted about, and I think he's going to be great and fine.
Thank you. That's really satisfying as an answer.
Okay, sorry, it was a rather long answer.
No, I'm just so happy that this has happened and that the two of you are just settled in so completely and happily.
Thank you, my darling. It is so nice to hear your voice.
How has it been actually this? I mean, I imagine for a young person to live in a lockdown kind of world at a time you're finding your feet, you're finding uh, your voice in the world, the adult you is taking shape, and to then sort of live in a world where a lot of these social cues and the ways of interaction are now so limited. I don't know how it is in England and in your town, particularly at this point, but I know for college-going kids here, I'm hearing that it's been hard. How? I mean, obviously, you can't speak for him, but as has his mom, what have you seen? How is it that young people are dealing now?
I think that I think that it is a very difficult. I think it's really difficult to be so available in social media terms, in terms of the kind of the WhatsApp and the Snapchat and the Instagrammy kind of the social media, that persona that you have as an internet person. I don't even have the words to talk about this, but I think it definitely contributes to a higher level of anxiety, and perhaps in some ways a more risk averse angle on the world. I mean, I think that, and I could be wrong about, I mean, I'm talking off the top of my head at this point. I could be completely wrong about this, but it seems to me that young people are, when we were growing up, I mean, part of what it was to be a young person was you took risks, you fell in love, you had bad experiences, you were quite devil may care, stuff went wrong, you picked yourself up. It was, you found out about limits because you went beyond them and then you got stung. My sense is that in our kids' generation, the consequences of making mistakes are so much more severe personally, because they immediately set off a chain reaction of social media ripples at best. That I think the level of kind of self-policing is perhaps much higher, and I think, on a gut feeling, I think is just not a good thing. I just feel like, if you're too concerned, it's that very ordinary thing of saying, well, if you're too concerned about health and safety, then you make playgrounds which are so safe that children don't know what it means to fall off a swing and hurt themselves, so they don't think that they can, so they don't develop those kind of instincts of self-preservation and all of that kind of stuff. So I think something similar might be going on in terms of young people and their relationship to social media, and so that kind of thing, there's a sense that those consequences are much more severe than they would have been had we not had this kind of ubiquitous logging of every move and moment that we now have.
I mean, I used to think that people now in their teens, 20s, they've grown up with a computer in the house. Many of them got phones when they were in school, preteens or as teens sometimes. And I initially thought that these would be kids who would be far more comfortable with the online world than people who are now in their 30s and 40s and 50s, who sort of saw this come in during their lifetimes and changed. Like I was on the cusp of a lot of these things because these things were happening as I was starting out my working life. And so just the comfort with online communication and the wonder was still predominant. The thing of being able to sit in your bedroom with a creaky modem making noises and then communicate instantly with someone on the other side of the world and watch their sentences take shape on your ICQ screen and stuff like that was wondrous. But I just recently saw this documentary, the Social Dilemma, which was scary.
Like, cover your fucking camera right now.
Yeah. And I've had these discussions with people across all age groups about the different. So yes, for instance, perceptions of what we would consider private and personal and things like that. Those boundaries, the public, the personal, the private, the secret. These are all different dimensions of this, and how people are living their lives out there in very different ways, visible in some cases. I mean, the part of me that looks at young people say discuss their dating lives or their sex lives on Twitter, and there's a part of me that is going, really? But I wouldn't do that. But some of it's nice to have that kind of discussion out in the open, because some of the tabooness, the demystifying, all of that kind of thing does take place as well. But there's this angle as well, which is the young girls particularly, who are very, very, according to the stats in the Social Dilemma, which I've read elsewhere, being affected so much by peer group approval of the way they look at a time when they're finding themselves, and how that can affect them, the levels of mental illness, the levels of suicide going up in those things. It's actually, it's not as rosy as I thought it would be for these young people.
Yeah, I know. I mean, but then also I have to say, in terms of Roshan, he is far more casually disconnected from his mobile phone than I am. He is far more likely to leave it at home and go out for a walk in the hills just because it's nice than I am.
Okay.
And I think that I think maybe his generation is more adept at disconnecting than I think they are. And maybe some of this is projection. I hope so. I don't know. I was wondering if we've got Urvashi Butalia here on mute, and I would love her to unmute and to say something, because I haven't heard her voice for so long, my old boss. And if she has a question, that would be even nicer.
Oh dear, I don't have a question. I'm just listening to you with such great enjoyment, both of you. And I don't know, I don't have a question. I have a comment.
That's good.
Which is something that I've always known, but not ever said to you, that when you left Zuban and went off to England, you broke my heart. But here you are doing such wonderful stuff that I'm so delighted you left and went off.
Yay. That's very good to hear, Urv. I think you're not alone. I mean, it was really, really, really hard to leave India. It took at least, I think, 3 to 4 years of fairly and sometimes very, very difficult conversations, introspection, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. It was not an easy decision. It was a decision that was full of risk and full of dilemma, and I had many, many people saying, do not do this. Seriously, do not do this. It's a terrible idea. It'll have very bad consequences, not just for, well, mainly for your son, and you know, how are you going to live? You don't have a job, don't do it. And also because people, I think, really, I mean, they really liked having me around. It's like, yeah, so don't go. So it was really nice to be, you know, not, people didn't want me to leave. That's nice. But like I was saying earlier, it was it was in some ways a kind of perfect storm of different pulls and different pushes that led me to a point where my not leaving was harder than leaving. So I think there's that, there are those points in life, aren't there, where you're there are some times when you just feel like you're pushing and pushing and pushing against something because you need something to change, or you want something to change, you fight for something to be different, and you're confronted with a lot of resistance. And then there are those points at which, if you're very lucky, something clicks. It feels like a tipping point in a good way. And at that point, you feel like you're being supported and propelled along a certain path, because that's the easiest path. It becomes the easy path. It is a place of greater easefulness. And there was a point, you know, maybe 6 months or 8 months before we left, that it became, it seems to me to be that at that point it would be harder to stay than to leave. And that kind of good tipping point thing has also happened in terms of the environmental stuff that I'm doing, because I think most people who are at all involved in environmentalism are, for any length of time, have experienced that as being a series of battles that you know you're not going to win, but you are beholden to fight because you believe that they're the right battles to fight. And what I found most surprising and most delightful and most encouraging about my life here is that all of the things that I want to do and affect and make happen seem to have such widespread and surprising support from not just my friends and people who read The Guardian, my immediate family, who are always lovely, but from, you know, the local council leaders to people at the other end of political spectrums from me, to, you know, older people to younger people. There is a general sense that I get here that the kinds of things that we're doing at transition towns, for example, taking what was a privately owned piece of 8.5 acre field that's generally just used as a dog walking circuit, that's now in public ownership, and we are creating a forest garden on that site, which will be much better for the it's basically just much better for the human and the more than human world. So it's going to be much more, it's increasing biodiversity, it's increasing resilience, it's creating a useful and edible forest in a place where there was not very, I mean, a very, very lovely, but not very biodiverse piece of semi-wasteland kind of ground, open space, lovely, beautiful aspects and great, lovely field and everything, but can be enhanced in certain ways by listening to what the land wants, and also listening to what the humans who live around the land want, and finding a way to answer many of those needs in a way which is going to enhance the biodiversity of the land. And for me, doing something which in any way enhances biodiversity is you know, it's just a really, it's like a day well lived sort of thing. Like, I think monoculture of any kind, agricultural or cultural, is soul destroying and planet destroying. And I think diversity, bibliodiversity, biodiversity, cultural diversity, diversity is what makes something juicy, tasty, resilient, able to withstand shocks, nourishing in all kinds of ways. So the other book that so yeah, so going back to Nilanjana's question about creativity, you know, it is to do with time and place as well. And you know, I spent 10 years writing Grave Pyres, which is a little children's story, in some ways a little book, in some ways an absolutely huge kind of earth-shattering work of spiritual depth and meaning. And I genuinely mean that. I mean, I'm laughing as well because it's also funny, but I also believe that. So there was Grave Pyres, there was A Year in Kingham, there's a lovely little picture book that I wrote for Pratham called Power of 10. And there's a nature writing anthology, an almanac that I co-edited with a friend of mine called Pippa Marland, called, and the book was called Gifts of Gravity and Light. And it's a book of diverse nature writing from different people, from 12 different writers, including me and Pippa, from around the UK, and including Tishani Doshi as one of my favorite Indian writers. But all of these books have come out in the last like year and a half. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It feels like I've been hugely, massively busy and creative and, you know, just writing madly. And I haven't at all. I'm quite a lazy person who likes watching lots of reruns of Grace and Frankie on Netflix and doing as little as possible, really, and petting my cat and my friend's dog and just hanging about, going for nice walks and stuff. But it does feel like, you know, some sort of planets have aligned in order to create this London bus effect where you wait for ages and ages and ages and then 3 come along at once, or in my case 4, or possibly 5. So I don't know if this will continue. I have no idea if this will continue or whether it's just one of those periods. I know it won't continue forever. I mean, I know it won't continue for very long, actually, because we're all going to grow old and become irrelevant and die, and then other things and other people will come up and be relevant and continue, and then they'll, you know, so it's not, I don't feel like, oh yay, I've finally got my due or anything. It's just like, oh gosh, this is nice. You know, I hope it continues for a bit, because I think I have other things that I'd like to do and say and write about. And I just feel very, 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 just very lucky and very blessed to be able to have the opportunity to do this stuff, you know.
It was just bringing back that again, what Ranjana said after she met you in England. She says, you know, Anita was never an unhappy person.
No.
You know, but just the difference here is just sort of a I don't know, I can't remember what she said exactly, but it was to the effect that there were dimensions to you which were now being able to express themselves and come out more fully. I was thinking also what you said just now about the bit of land and what the land wants. And I think listening to that is also something that has been lessons that we've learned as humans over time. I remember reading about the Sayad rays and Minalga rays and British coming here and saying scrubland,
Mm.
therefore not useful,
Yeah.
and therefore let's plant eucalyptus. So
No,
whatever
yeah.
it is.
So in my town in Wellington, at the bottom of my road, in fact, is a little nature reserve, which adjoins a rugby pitch. Now, the rugby club said we would like to expand our pitches to include a junior pitch for the children of the town who have nowhere to play rugby. So we're going to apply to the council to clear this scrubland, which only has on it self-seeded trees, as though the idea that a self-seeded tree was completely worthless because it had not been planted by a person. And this seemed to me the height of fucking arrogance. I was incandescent with rage. And luckily and thankfully, so were many, many people in the town. And we went and we stood in front of those trees, and Roshan tied his Gryffindor scarf around one of them. And we said, no, not on our watch, and certainly not at this time of year when the birds are nesting, and you can't do this, and we refuse to let you do this. And I, who am a very faint-hearted environmentalist, to be honest, I don't like conflict, and I'm not very good at protesting. I hover around the edges, kind of giving people thumbs ups who are actually protesting, but I'm a bit of a wimp when it comes to all that stuff. So in terms of Extinction Rebellion, I support them fully from a slight distance because I'm a little bit of a scaredy cat, and I think they're very brave. And yes. So, so what was I saying? So I don't know. So anyway, but yes, lots of that, that utter disregard for the rights and the integrity of the wild. The wild, which, you know, like people, I've been doing a lot of editing for an academic journal called Anthropocenes, and it's extraordinary the kind of convoluted language that is bubbling up in this kind of anthropocenic soup of academies, which is that thing. It's really hard to edit because you're kind of like losing your mind in terms of the concatenations. But one of the things that most academics who are talking about this kind of issue talk about is changing the language. So you know, we've had all these debates about not calling it global warming but global heating, not talking about fish stocks but fish populations, not talking about a climate crisis, no, climate bio. I mean, basically, looking at the language that's used tells you a lot about how urgent or how valuable people, the values that are attached to different things. Mm-hmm. So calling something a piece of scrubland and self-seeded trees, and even things like, you know, you very routinely hear about the human and the non-human world. The non-human world, the rest of it. But I much prefer to use, and in all my writing, I tend to use the phrase the more than human world, because it's not that, you know, there are the humans and then there are not humans. It's that there are humans and then there's this more than human world in which we subsist, on which we rely, of which we are part of. And it's so much more than us. It's not that we are the thing and there's this other thing which is not us. It is so much more than us. And I think a phrase like more than human just signals that much more clearly than even talking about, you know, like, I wish there was another word than nature. I don't particularly like the phrase, like I think of myself, or describe myself as a nature writer with a certain amount of unease, because, you know, what's not nature? It's all bloody nature. all the interesting stuff anyway, all the alive stuff. There's humans and civilization exist because nature is there as part of it. We're all, how many animals live on your bloody eyelashes for you to think, we're not separate. And I think that that's maybe the thing that all of my work and all of my creativity, perhaps, it kind of, if you have to boil it down to something, it's we are not separate. The myth that we are separate beings is a fucking myth, and it needs to be exploded. And it's now 7 o'clock in England and time for a bedtime story. I love the sound of that clock. Sorry.
One aspect which I actually wanted to touch on, which I never got around to earlier. You've sort of lived your life crossing between cultures. Born here, brought a large part of your growing up was in England. Then you came back, and you had your son in India, and your son is now multicultural too, in the sense of what, despite, in addition to what he has inherited, he is now seeing different worlds as well. And how do you think, I mean, of course, you have nothing to compare it with because that is the life that you lived. You didn't have the chance to live an alternate life where you lived in one culture all your life. But given this, how do you think that this crossing between cultures affected you? What are perspectives that you think you have got now that perhaps you wouldn't have had if, for instance, you had just spent all your life in England, or if once your parents moved here, that they decided to spend all their lives in Calcutta?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, and in fact, it's a very similar question to what someone else asked me recently. And I was saying to them about being a woman in India, being an Angrezi, or a somewhat at least Angrezi woman in India. I think I got away with a lot more. I mean, people just like cut me quite a lot of slack, I think, that wouldn't have otherwise had I been fully Indian. There was a lot more there's a lot more wiggle room within the family, particularly, that okay, she's a bit different because of this thing, and therefore I could sort of weave my way in and out. I never got married to Roshan's father, for example, which was tricky from family-wise, but I think that it would have been much more difficult had I not been partly English, and therefore slightly there was a greater sense of kind of forgiveness, if you like. Forgive her for her sins, for she knows not quite how to do things. But also, I think if I had been fully English as a woman in Delhi, particularly, I would have found it even harder, because there's a sense that a white woman is more an easier target in some ways for sexual comments and general kind of harassment than someone who carries themselves as though they belong there. And partly one of the reasons I think that I was so comfortable with my life in India was because I felt like it was kind of my place. And I think that part of the reason that Roshan feels and certainly felt when he first came here that he was acceptable in English society was because he felt that that was his place, also partly because he was partly English. So I think the mixed race thing, as well as the mixed cultural thing, you know, I think it I don't know. I do I do feel like I can't make a generalization about it, but for me, in my family, it seems to have worked quite well. I mean, I've sort of come out of it quite well. I haven't had a lot of racist abuse here. I didn't face that so much in school, even though I was in a very, very white school, partly because my slight Indianness came across as exotic and therefore quite desirable, as opposed to weird food, strange smell, you know, immigrant weirdo. So, but you know that it's a slightly tricky one, because, well, it's like I was watching this documentary about Bruce Lee. Be Water. Really great documentary. When we were growing up, me and my brothers, we used to watch this film called Kung Fu, which was about a Shaolin monk.
It was David Carradine, right?
David Carradine, exactly.
Oh.
And we loved it. We thought it was very, very cool. And we all basically wanted to be David Carradine, trudging across the sand dunes with his cloak on and being kind of mysterious and focused and being like water, and kind of deadly but cool. Mm-hmm. What I didn't realize until I watched that documentary was that Bruce Lee wrote Kung Fu, and he wrote it as a story that he would star in. He was a very ambitious, film star, megastar, and he wrote this TV series in order for him to have a vehicle to talk about his spiritual philosophy, in a way. And the American TV companies that made it said, our audience is not ready for someone who sounds Chinese and looks as Asiatic as you. Mm. So they cast David Carradine, who's not Chinese, in order to play this enough of a Chinese character in order to be acceptable. So that struck me as being there's something to do with the mixed race look, which tends towards a kind of acceptability. I don't know. It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. You look at, I don't know.
He was before he became a crossover star. He played the sidekick in another series, Green Hornets, where he played the Asian guy. His name was, what was the character's name? Kato or something like that.
Kato, yeah.
And then he post, the second movie, which was, I think, what was done as Return of the Dragon or whatever, which brought him that worldwide kind of stardom. But you see that kind of reluctance even within a limited market like, a diverse country like India, where Priyanka Chopra played Mary Kom, right? Because it was not, her name would sell the movie, rather than having an actress who was closer ethnically. And it's not that there were no actors available to play. A number of stories that came out about that, I remember, around that time. But yes, Sanjoy, do you want to come in? I've enabled turning on the microphone if you want to, Sanjoy.
Am I registering?
Perfect.
Yay.
Hi.
Hi.
What should I say? I'm Anita's brother.
Tell us all the stuff about Anita that she hasn't told us.
Look, I have a life that needs to be lived in, and I can't do that publicly.
Yeah, it was worth a try. Wow.
No, I was actually going to ask you, Sanj, about the whole thing about mixed raceness. Whether you, what do you think? What do you think about that? Good thing, bad thing, weird thing. You've written about it.
Yeah, I think it's it's excellent for me. It's something that one needs to think through, because you don't have your identities handed to you, but that's actually quite a positive thing. As you're growing up, you have to sort of discover a route for yourself. I was very struck by what you said, that it tends towards acceptability, which I think is also very true. And it's yeah, I mean, having an English mother and a paler skin and an English accent and those kind of things immediately place you in as you say, in a more acceptable, rather more exotic, acceptable way than, for example, our father, who's very obviously born and raised in India and so on.
But what also comes across, at least in our family, really quite strongly, is my mum's. I think there's a kind of almost like a dislike of her own ethnicity. It's something like she's constantly saying, "Oh, you're lucky because you've got Indian genes, and how nice, and your skin doesn't burn, and your hair is nice." And she can be very disparaging of her own ethnicity, her own cultural background.
Yeah, I think that's partly personal, but maybe also to take it back to food a little bit. One of the things with our mother that I have always felt, and continue to do so, is that she effortlessly out-Indians all of us, quite in terms of clothing, food, cooking, language. She speaks very good Bengali, and I feel, I'm a hopeless at cooking Indian food, and that's partly because she's just so good. There's like no way that I would be able to do that. Yeah.
This is also true.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that a Sourdough I see before me?
That is a Sourdough I'm hoping to persuade to talk. I'm actually happy Sourdough came, because she told me she had class, and that there was a clash of timing. So thanks for coming, Sourdough.
I managed to end my class early. Hi, Anita. So lovely to see you.
Oh, sure.
I have no deep question. I've just been listening to you for the last 2 hours and enjoying it thoroughly. Feels like we've caught up again in Bombay or Delhi.
It really does. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I have missed so much being here, apart from the food, which out trumps all of you guys, is you guys. And having these kind of conversations, it's just been lovely. I mean, it just feels like I'm back in, Gulmohar Park or House Cars or somewhere nattering late into the night. The other thing that I really miss is Old Monk and Coke.
It's a vile drink, Anita. Forget it.
I know, but somehow it works in India. I had some here, it was horrible. But, Salil ji, hello. You're calling in from New York.
Yes, I am. Which is not flooded. I mean, at least my part isn't, but yeah, it was quite bad where it was. I mean, upstate New York was quite bad. Just north of Manhattan was quite bad. Yeah, I mean, it reminded me of Kalba Devi and Grant Road, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I mean,
except that the temperature was much
ways.
lower and the wind was much stronger, but it did feel like that. But obviously, it had fatal consequences. About 40 odd people have died, so it's not something to be laughed at. And I mean, the speed with which the city has sprung back is also quite something. But then Bombay also does that. It springs back very quickly. So I'm very pro Bombay on that. But I did have not a question, but a comment. And I mean, I don't know where I come down on it. But both of you have spoken about growing locally and having local food and having things which are made by hand and not processed. And all of that I do take on board, and of course I like to eat that. But to what extent is this a middle class luxury? Because the kind of food we want is the kind we will get from a nice organic place. I mean, at least in London, where I was there for 20 years, in New York, where I have been now for the last 2 years, you get it at specialized stores at much more expensive prices than what you would at a Tesco in England or at a Walmart or its equivalent in America. And my question, therefore, is this a kind of middle class indulgence that is being imposed on people who can't afford it? Because eating good food costs a lot of money, and processed food is cheap.
I think that lies at the heart of the ecological crisis and the climate crisis that we are facing, which is that fast food and processed food and supermarkets and the economy of food that we have created for ourselves is cheap only in monetary terms. It is extremely expensive in terms of the cost to the earth. And that cost is not reflected in the cost.
No, I accept that. But Anita, if I'm earning $10 an hour and working at a store, that's what I'm going to buy. I'm not going to make the larger calculation for the good of the next generation. I have to feed my kids tonight.
Yeah, no, I know, Salil, but if you look at, the things that make me think that this is not just a question of privilege and class and niche kind of choices is things like, there's a film called, I think it's called Kiss the Soil, which is an American film about the kind of farming practices in the Midwest, the huge fields and the corn and the breadbasket kind of way. And one of the main, possibly the main ways of carbon capture and storage is to do with changing agricultural practices, not to make them more expensive, but to change. It's about changing the paradigm of what you do as a farmer. So rather than saying, okay, I want maximum mechanization and maximum efficiency because that's what's going to give me maximum return, is actually changing the paradigm where you're saying, and this is actually true, that if you have interplanting, for example, where the harvesting of something is more complicated because you've got corn alongside squash alongside something else, the harvesting of something may be more complicated, it may be more labor intensive, but the actual productivity of that acre of land is literally more profitable because the kind of soil that you're growing your vegetables in is requiring less artificial fertilizers in order to make it productive at all. So if we look at, and if we have approximately 60, possibly now 50 years of topsoil left in the world in order to grow all these crops in order to feed ourselves. So I feel like having at least watched some documentaries and films which are made by a combination of soil scientists and actual farmers, that the way in which we think about the economics of farming and agricultural farming has to change. It just has to change, and it probably won't, which means that we're probably all completely screwed. But I don't buy the idea that food grown better for the planet is food necessarily more expensive. I just don't buy that. I don't think that that's true. I think that that's another capitalist myth, because it's actually the farmers who are growing those kinds of crops in those kind of ways they're not making huge amounts of money anyway. And because their crops are being wiped out by one pest, their crops are being wiped out by the fact that the soil is so weak it's being washed away by one misplaced rain shower. And because also that misplaced rain shower is going to be 8 times as extensive as it used to be. So there's no resilience built into that system at all. And capitalism has forced us to think of the best systems as the ones with the least give in them, the ones that are just in time delivery and all of that kind of shit, which is coincidentally, not coincidentally, the most fragile kind of system and the least able to absorb any shocks, which it's currently getting a lot of every year. Oh, sorry, I've gone on to a big rant, Salil, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's fine.
I was thinking of this, see, Anita, there's the thing here about connecting to what we were talking about right at the beginning, which is obesity, for instance. A lot of that results from, in the ways, how Salil started what he was saying as well, which is, and the words that he used, that it's monetarily cheapest in a certain kind of way, but there are other costs. The thing is that monetarily is the only way we can look at it for some of us, right? If you, I'm buying Salil's point about you're able to take these calls when you have a little bit more money. But why are poor people putting on weight? Because cheap food is what they can afford. And that cheap food is overprocessed. It's high in, preservatives. It's high in kind of ingredients that will last through a delivery chain and so on and so forth. And I mean, these are debates related to so much of else that we have, which is, the developed world has already buggered the environment, and now you're telling less developed parts of the world, hey, listen, don't do that. But you're past that now, so you don't need to do that anymore. You don't need to pollute anymore. So you're cool to say you don't need to pollute. But if I don't have any options, it's all very interconnected and very fraught on how you can look at that. I mean, you can't afford.
And Peter, I mean, and Peter, just on that, I mean, this is an argument I've often had. And I don't make this argument just to rile my friends in the West, but those who say that India should have better public transport and trains and buses and all that instead of all these people driving cars and scooters. And I said, yeah, if you're a woman in India and you're going to use public transport, it's not a pleasant experience. Let's leave it at that. Anita, you spoke about some of that, earlier in your intervention. So it's very easy to preach. That, I mean, everyone should use a public transport, but it's, I mean, a lot of women prefer to drive their mopeds and probably their Marutis or small cars because of the safety it provides them. If they can afford it. Again, this is the affordability comes in. If you can't afford those, then you have to go in a bus and get molested, if not worse.
Well, that's partly, I mean, that's why we need such a huge paradigm shift. There was a report in the Guardian a couple of weeks ago about the cost, that making a point about the cost of various things, that if the whole of the UK, if the government decided that all public transport was to be made free, it would cost them the same as it costs them to maintain the nuclear Trident missile program. Now, that that is a mad world. That is a mad world. It is a mad, mad world that wastes a third of the food that is produced and tolerates levels of extreme hunger and starvation and obesity, and is it looks from the outside like it was designed to do that. That's not a unfortunate byproduct. It's kind of designed to do that, and you know, that is when I look at things like that, that is where I despair, and where it's very hard to duck the charge that you're being all right jackish and parochial and blindly optimistic and naive. Actually, it's very hard to duck that charge, because actually you probably are. I mean, I probably am, to be honest. Yeah.
When you talk about, again, the capitalist system and this and that, and the efficiencies of bringing food in that way, but here we have, as you said, so much wastage. It can't be that efficient a system if so much is getting wasted along the way, and if so much is being discarded and thrown into refuse and all sorts of just merely the delivery chain, the wastage along the way. But I don't know, it's complex.
It is.
No
It is.
Are one thing.
Yeah, and I don't know. It is complex, and yeah, I don't know. I get to this stage in the proceedings and kind of run out of things to say, because the complexity and the size of the problem is so huge, and all I can do is to take some encouragement from the fact that there are some very, very smart people, compassionate people, people who have the imagination to think outside of the structures of normality that we have come to accept as the way that things are, who are maybe starting to being listened to in high places. I do think that the pandemic and the IPCC report and the just the extreme brinksmanship, ship brink that we find ourselves at this point, has people who actually have the power to affect change sitting up and taking notice and doing something about it. I think it's probably too late, and I think it's probably too little, and I think we're all probably doomed. But there's part of me, there's quite a large part of me which thinks it's an extraordinarily miraculous, beautiful, amazing, astonishing, beautiful, amazing, astonishing place, the earth that we have the privilege of living on at this point of time in these particular incarnations. And it's almost churlish to not celebrate that, as well as lamenting and desperately trying to save her, which is where my joy and some of my writing is more to do with celebrating that than anything. But I do, one of the things that I have said in other forums on the sort of nature writing end of things is that I find a lot of the most exciting and challenging and beautiful and moving creative nonfiction that's happening at the moment is called nature writing. It falls under that umbrella of nature writing, which wasn't really a genre, 10 years ago, and it's now a really significant big chunk of most bookshops, at least here. because that's where the big questions are being asked and the important stuff is being talked about, and that comes from a sense that this is what's at stake, this is what we're losing. So there's that sense of kind of actual and also anticipatory grief, which is like rocket fuel to a certain kind of literary creativity, because it really matters. It really matters to the people who are writing these books. People like Richard Mabey and Robert Macfarlane and Helen MacDonald and Jay Griffiths and Peter Fine. I mean, just like so many fantastic nature writers, because they're talking about things that they are in a state of kind of anticipatory grief about having lost. And it has that sort of almost muscular, heartbreaking quality to a lot of the writing, because this is stuff that really matters to people. Because the fate of all, the fate of the world rests on it. It's quite as stark as that.
Yet a part of me also listens to what you were saying as well, which is sort of a human-centric view of the world. This planet has been hotter, it's been colder. Its air has been very different from what it is now, in a way that's hospitable towards us, humans and current life forms. The planet will survive, I tend to think, in that sense. I mean, I don't mean in obvious literal terms. Of course, it will, until such a point as the sun starts to expand and melts everything in the vicinity and all of that kind of stuff in a few billion years. But yeah, the thing is that we also have to think, yes, we have to not think of ourselves the center of this planet, but thinking of ourselves as the center of this planet will perhaps motivate us more to keep this planet hospitable to us. Because the planet will survive if it gets a few degrees hotter. Life will evolve in some ways. Some of current life may not be. If it gets a few degrees colder, yes, there have been ice ages, there have, all of that. But I think perhaps we do need to have that little bit of a human-centric viewpoint to, the enlightened self-interest, if not for ourselves, for our children or whatever it is, to ensure that there is a planet that they can live in rather than just a planet that will survive.
Yeah. Yeah, that is another way of looking at it. And I think anything which in which we cultivate that attitude of compassion to each other and to other life forms is going to be a good guide or a good indicator of where we should be moving, how we should be moving towards something. Yeah.
Ask you, Anita, is to also put together, if at some later point, and I'll share it with everyone who attended today, reading that you recommend, or things that you recommend that people watch that shape your views, that you think that are interesting, and I'll share it with everyone who attended today.
Yeah, I would love to do that. One of the things that I miss is actually having my I used to write this column for the Business Line, which was called On the Shelf, and it was just basically this is a book recommendation. Because I really miss recommending stuff to people. I mean, it's one of my favorite things. It's like, oh, you have to read this. So I would love to do that. Thank you, Peter, and thank you so much for this this evening of talking. It's been so nice. It's kind of, I feel
for 3 hours now.
I feel rather nourished. It's so lovely to hear and to see people from my other life,
my next challenge is going to be finding a guest who Sourdough doesn't know, because she turns out knows people that I know who I have no idea that she knows. She was at the last show and she knew Ananya, and I didn't know she knew you, and here she is again. So
it is like Surabhi is the living myth buster of the idea that we are separate, because we are all connected by Surabhi. She is human mycelium, connecting us all.
Anita, Tishani is my colleague over here, by the way. So we are connected through Tishani as well.
Ah. See, we're not separate. We are just the little fruiting bodies of the underground mycelium network. Anyway, on that note,
we wind up. Kartika, Sanjoy, Urvashi, Salil, do you want to say anything before we wind up? You have your microphones on.
Yeah, I just want to eat your sourdough bread whenever we meet next, Anita.
You're on. You're on.
Yeah.
And since it will be without coriander, all the more a reason. Yeah.
No coriander involved at all.
When Anita and I were talking earlier in the week, she ate sourdough bread at me with homemade jam. This was psychologically very damaging, but yes.
But Anita's store has opened up near your old home, which sells great sourdough.
Yay!
I've been here. But anyway, I've got to go because I've got yoga class at the crack of dawn. So good night, guys. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you for coming in, Urvashi. And does anyone else want to say anything before we wind? Okay, so I'm assuming not. So thank you so much, all of you, for staying for staying for these 3 hours, all of you. I know some people left messages as they had to leave for various reasons, and that's cool. Because I do tell people that it's completely okay if you don't stay for beyond the 2 hours, because sometimes these conversations can go on. But thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening. Thank you to those of you who came in to join the conversation. And Anita Roy, such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pete. It's been lovely.
All right. And we'll be back with our next table talk in 2 weeks. So I do hope folks will join us, and everybody who came here just for Anita, perhaps now you would consider coming for other table talks as well. But now, thank you and bye-bye.